And we've been looking at the life of the Buddha, as I was saying in the first half. We've been looking at the life of the Buddha, and in particular we've been looking at this book, Gautama Buddha, by Vishvapani Blomfield, and it's a very, very good book, very interesting book, available in this bookshop. And but it's also, one way of talking about it, it's like a biography of the Buddha, because Vishvapani has looked at, he's looked at what various scholars have said, and drawn on, the life of the Buddha, and actually tried to look at what actually happened, the best we can see, what actually happened in the Buddha's life. And with this, it's really interesting because sometimes it's a whole mix of history and myth. And for Buddhists, myth is equally as important as history. It's very, very important. So you'll read about the historical things that happened in the Buddha's life, but also you'll have lots of, the Buddha teaching the gods, various demons, etc. And it's certainly for a Buddhist, it's very important to include that mythical aspect. It might not be historically true, but it's definitely mythically true, and there's definitely got a lot of resonance and meaning. So in the last few weeks, we've seen that the Buddha, started as Siddhartha Gautama. He was a prince, and he was born into wealth and privilege. He decided to give all that up, and he became a wandering monk, or rather a kind of a wandering holy man. And he just wore rags, and he found himself in the depths of the forest, the depths of the Indian jungle. And this was a wild place. This was very wild. I sometimes like to think about our experience here, or maybe particularly in London, but in England, where we've mostly got cities and towns, and then with a bit of countryside around about. And it's really nice to go into the countryside. We've got the North Downs, South Downs, not far away, Epping Forest within an hour. But in those days, it was definitely wilderness, but with villages, towns, and emerging cities within that wilderness. So it was quite a different mindset. And so I'm just going to try and evoke some of that and try and encourage you to think about how it would be to live in the wilderness, but maybe in your village or town that's surrounded by wilderness, surrounded by wild animals, tigers, snakes. I've got a friend who has moved back to India now. He's from South India, and he just used to tell stories sometimes about finding a snake in the village and then having to pick it up and sort of get rid of it, put it outside the village, and it was just normal for him to have that. So the wilderness was quite a dangerous place, quite a fearsome place. There were bandits, and you just had to be very, very careful. So just trying to get us into a sort of a different mindset, to have a think about what life the Buddha lived in, and it was a very traditional society. So he, as we've been hearing over the weeks, he over many years he practiced austerities. He learned from various teachers. He had his own followers, but he decided to go his own way. And he just had a realization one day, a memory of a time when he was very young. And it was a time when he was watching his father, the king, plough the fields in a ceremonial ploughing. And he had an experience of timelessness and bliss. And this happened spontaneously. And he realised that this was something that maybe this was the way to follow. He could go inwards into his experience and maybe find deeper and richer experience within himself. And so he waded across the Naranja Narrandera River, I say it right, and found himself in a grove of trees, and he sat beneath a tree called the Bodhi tree, and decided to meditate and see if he can, get to the truth of things. And that was the evening, and by the morning he'd attained what we call enlightenment. And he saw the truth of things, and he saw how things truly are. And he didn't just see them, but he was totally transformed by them. He became a different being. He became a new type of being. No one had been like him ever before in the world. His consciousness was quite different. He'd seen through the delusion of a fixed and separate self, and the outcome of that was he became fearless. He became truly confident. He became truly compassionate. Had a strong imaginative identification with all life. All his energies had got aligned, got integrated, and so he just became fully whole, fully realised, fully enlightened. And from this state, he began to wonder whether he could actually communicate, because it was a state free from suffering, free from any sort of mental suffering, and he wondered if he could, actually communicate this and help other people to gain what he had gained. And he had his doubts, but he eventually resolved them, and he decided to teach. And a couple of weeks ago, Dayabhadra was looking at how he met up with his former followers and taught them. And as we see again and again in the Buddha's life, it's not so much about a teaching about knowledge, about giving someone ideas and knowledge, but it's a communication from the enlightened mind to the unenlightened mind. It's a sparking off. He managed to spark off something in these other people. He managed to communicate something of what he'd experienced so that they could experience it as well. And they began to see things the way things are as well. So, in a way, this was the beginning of Buddhism, what we call Buddhism. This teacher and disciple over the centuries, but basically a communication from enlightenment to the unenlightened, sparking off this activating the potential of his disciples. And so Dayabhadra also talked about Yasa and also his family and friends who also became followers. And we're going to take this further. We're going to talk this evening about some of the other followers of the Buddha. In particular, we're going to look at the monks and the nuns, so the order that he set up. So before that, can I just pull that cushion? Sorry, it's just going to pop it behind me. So the Buddha spent the rest of his life just communicating to whoever would listen, basically. Whether that was farmers, princes, beggars, whoever it was, he just talked to them. And it wasn't just what he said. I mean, we've got a lot of the words that he said have come down through history, as near as we know, because in the first 500 years it was an oral tradition before things were written down. But I believe that actually people's memories were a lot better in those days. But we've got quite a lot of words that have come down to us. But it wasn't just the words with the Buddha. The Buddha had a presence. If you met the Buddha, you definitely experienced something other, something different. You experienced the energy of the Buddha. You experienced the kindness of the Buddha. You experienced the clarity of the Buddha. And Vishvapani in his book describes him not just as a teacher, but as a shaman. I thought was quite an interesting way of looking at it. Shamanic, something almost magical and potent about meeting the Buddha. When you met him, some people just didn't need to hear anything from the Buddha to actually really experience the power and the strength of the Buddha's enlightened experience. And people would respond sometimes. They would respond just by bowing to him, or a full-length prostration, because of the realization that they'd sort of seen something that he'd seen, and it was just incredible. They couldn't even imagine it beforehand, and they might just bow in front of him or prostrate and just say, "Oh, it's wondrous. It's like a light in the dark. It's like something that had been upturned has been put right." So it was this sort of sense of incredible appreciation, like they've been given something very, very precious, and you could really never imagine. And maybe you've had a glimpse of that, maybe in meditation, as Silapir was saying before. Sometimes we just don't know what's around the corner in meditation. We're opening a door into our minds, into our lives, and we sometimes don't really know, or we never really know what's going to turn up, and we could just be opening the door to something really, really wonderful. And something happens when you hear that, then faith arises, and Shraddha is the word in Sanskrit, Shraddha, which is translated as faith, but it's not blind faith. It's also can be translated as confidence or confidence trust. But it's something that resonates in us with the transcendental, with the enlightenment experience. So we've all got the seeds of enlightenment within us, and it's because of that, it means that we can resonate with the enlightened state, with the enlightened mind. So when we hear the words of the Buddha, or when the people met the Buddha, they could just feel this resonance, and this resonance is Shraddha, confidence, trust, faith, and it's the heart's response, and it's this glimpse of a glimpse. And you might like to think in your own experience. I mean, it might be something, you might have had a big experience. You might have had just a glimpse of a glimpse yourself. Maybe, I know people who've just seen an image of the Buddha or a statue of the Buddha, and just be really drawn to the Buddha, drawn to the figure of the Buddha. Or maybe you've met a real Buddhist, and there's something that kind of draws you to this person. You're interested, or you've read a book. So you might like to think about that and just think, what was it for me? Because there's probably a reason you've come down to the centre and we want to learn to meditate and want to learn about different aspects of Buddhism. Because we've all got that seed in us, the seed of enlightenment, which is there, might be buried deep, but it can resonate. And it's really, really important to value that. If you ever do experience that, or when you do experience that, really value it, because, as Silapir was saying again at the break, what you dwell on, so you become. If you bring your attention to that, then you can allow it to grow. So you can allow this seed to grow, this seed of Shraddha, of confidence and trust. And so the people who met the Buddha, heard his words, experienced his presence, often had this emotional experience and maybe had a vision of something other. But they found they wanted to respond. They wanted to act. It wasn't just enough to feel that, even though that was a wonderful feeling in itself. When you have that feeling, you want to respond, you want to act, you want to do something, you want to change things. Because you begin to realise that the experience that you're having before doesn't really compare to the experience you're having now. or the glimpse you're having now. You see the unsatisfactoriness of your life in certain ways, and you want to move towards something that's more satisfactory, more satisfying, more meaningful. And you want to act in accordance with that vision you've had. And it's the path of growth, it's the path of development. We start where we're at now, and we become more than we are. We become more, much more. We can become much more than who we think we are now. Much more kind, much more aware, more generous, more fearless, more confident. There really isn't a limit, and it's difficult to sort of believe that somehow. But there really isn't a limit. The sky's the limit, as it were. Anyway, to do this act, to act upon that, is called going for refuge. It's a very traditional term, going for refuge, and it's a term that I must say I took quite a long time to sort of get my head around, because I sort of didn't immediately mean much to me in a way. I mean, one way of understanding it is the Buddha is one of the refuges. So there's traditionally in Buddhism there's 3 refuges, the triple refuge: the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. So as I was saying earlier, the Buddha, the enlightened being, but also the Dharma, his teaching, but it's also the way things truly are. And the Sangha is the when we go for refuge to the Sangha, it's the community of the Buddha's disciples who've attained, well, maybe enlightenment, but they're on their way to enlightenment. They've attained something very, very significant. And so, as Buddhists, we go for refuge to the 3 jewels. So we want to act, we want to begin to change our life in some way. We want to begin to meditate, begin to act a bit more ethically. We begin to form friendships with other Buddhists, etc. And it's committing ourselves. It's committing ourselves to our ideals. So it's a bit like seeing a mountain, a beautiful mountain. Imagine you're in the Himalayas and you see this beautiful mountain that's glinting in the sun, and the snow is glinting. And you think, oh, that's wonderful. And I suppose that's a bit like the first response, going, that's truly wonderful. I've never seen anything quite like it. That's like the response to the enlightened mind, to the meeting the Buddha. But then you realise that you can actually walk towards the mountain and climb the mountain itself. And that's going for refuge. You decide to act, you decide to go. And when we chant beforehand, we're saying Buddham Saranang Gacchami when we were doing the chanting in the first half. And Gacchami is go, so to the Buddha for refuge I go. So it's actually something you do. So in Buddhism isn't a passive tradition. It's a very active tradition. It's something you do, and whether that's with body, speech, or mind, and for instance, practice the ethical precepts. So it's a turning towards. So the people who began to follow the Buddha became similar to him. They became homeless wanderers. So the Buddha never settled down. He lived, out in the forest. He wore rags. So the robes he wore were stitched together, old rags that he found in a charnel ground. Sort of old rags that had just been stitched together. And he used to beg for his food, so he'd take his bowl around and beg from house to house in the village or the towns that he was living near. And so he lived a very basic life. He'd sleep at the root of a tree, out in the open, so in many ways he lived a very wild life. He was very much in touch with the wilderness. And he encouraged his followers to do the same. at least some of his followers who were happy and willing to do that. He had actually many, many followers who were householders, who stayed at home, but were definitely followers of the Buddha as well. So there was these two different followers, two different lifestyles. There was the homeless wanderers, and there was the householders. And so, broadly speaking, those were the two different types. In a way, there wasn't many options in those days. This was a very traditional society. I think we're so much freer now to have all sorts of lifestyles, and we can practice Buddhism in many, many different ways. But in those days, that was pretty much the options you had. You had to stay within society, take on the job you were supposed to do, raise a family, etc. Or you gave it all up and you became a homeless wanderer. And that was really the choice. But these people who became homeless wanderers, again, they're living in the forest, in the dangers of the forest. And it's easy to think, I think this is where the words monks and nuns can be a little bit misleading, because we've got this idea of these nicely ironed robes, beautiful colours, etc. But it mustn't have been anything like that. That must have been quite different. These were wild men and wild women. They were really living. In fact, I was trying to think of modern day examples, and there aren't many, I don't think. These are people living in the wilderness. They'd be wandering. So the Buddha encouraged them to wander from village to village, from town to town, to live a simple life, to meditate, to really strive for growth and development towards enlightenment. But also to teach as well, to teach what they knew, to maybe spark off other people. And of course in India, you've got the rainy season, you've got the monsoon. So for 3 or 4 months in the year, it becomes pretty impossible to walk anywhere. So what developed was the rainy season retreats. And this is where the Buddha and his followers would settle down just for those time. And they'd live, eventually they were given huts by people who were wealthy enough to give them huts. And eventually these were the starts of the monasteries. But in the Buddha's days, there were nothing like monasteries. There were just a few huts dotted around a bit of parkland. And there'd be more intensive meditation. And even today, we can have rainy season retreats where you have more intensive meditation. In a way, our retreats that we run here, or rather at Vajrasana, are like our rainy season retreats. It's a chance to have a bit more intensive practice. The monks and nuns were celibate, had few possessions, and had their own ethical code. And this is known as the Vinaya. And I can't remember how many rules that the modern monks and nuns have to live by, but it's rather a lot. I think it's over 200 in some traditions. But in the Buddha's day, in the first, when the Buddha started teaching, Vishvapani thinks it was a lot less structured than that. A lot of these rules were brought in to deal with, various experiences. And then they'd meet on the full moon, and they'd meet. You can imagine that there were no clocks in those days, and how would you know when to meet? But the full moon was the time to meet. You can imagine the full moon in India and meeting in a grove of trees with the local monks and nuns in your area and meditating and hearing the Dharma, hearing the teaching of the Buddha. So something could be very, very magical, and meditating through the night. So, the Buddha was the main teacher, but he also taught others, and they taught others. And as I was saying before, this is how Buddhism has come down to us over the years. I'm just wondering, do you see the need for a teacher? Do you think that's necessary? Or do you think we don't need need teachers.
A teacher?
A teacher,
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you want to say a bit more?
A mentor and a role model.
Yeah, great.
And somebody who has some wisdom.
Yeah.
Some things to say.
Yeah, great.
I think teaching is a fine profession.
Right.
Much needed. Yeah.
So does anybody sort of think that maybe they don't want a teacher, or there we go. Do you want to say a bit?
I thought I didn't need a teacher because although I've got a meeting with Jai tomorrow about being a lecturer after 17 years. Because, deep down I'm quite egotistical, and I think you put the Buddha on a pedestal, rightly so.
Yeah.
But even when we hear him talk, he says what he's done we can achieve. And I think, I've got the general patterns of things that I need to do. And he sat down and just meditated. He didn't have a teacher. He had teachers, but not the same way as we do.
Sure.
And also, I'm a bit sceptical of teachers because, it's kind of Chinese whispers from the Buddha passing down. And I think the core is in the Buddha's initial words. And there's a lot of merit in making things up, making your mind up yourself and going with your internal instinct. But at the same time, after 17 years, I had changed my mind.
Right.
Maybe I should have changed my mind 16 years ago.
But as you say, I think it's really interesting, and it's very appreciate you saying that. I think it's really interesting because everyone's got to make up their own minds, and we've all got to make our own decision on that. And I think that's so important. You can't just blindly follow. I think there's different extremes, isn't there? There is the extreme of if the Buddha did it, I'm going to do it all on my own. I don't need anybody's help. I don't need any teacher. Maybe I don't even need to read books, about Buddhism. I'm going to do it on my own. And, good luck. And, yeah.
Well, because actually the practice of mindfulness of breathing and Metta-bhavana are quite simple, and they are cornerstones of enlightenment, aren't they?
Yeah.
So, in a way, it feels like it's better to do those two practices and then no teachers than to have lots of teachers and not practice.
Yeah. But I guess you learn that from someone in a way, don't you? So in a way. Anyway, I don't want to. But I guess there is these two extremes, like a go it alone, but also there's the opposite of a sort of gullibility maybe, or I'm just going to do everything the teacher says, or, And really we need to, it's a sort of a middle way here, sort of be open to people further down on the path, but also we need to make up our own minds about it. We need to be, free to be a Buddhist. You've got to be free not to be a Buddhist, to be a Buddhist, as Bhante Samarachta says. And you need to be free to make up your own mind. So it's not a group religion. It's something that the individual does. They make their own minds up. Right. So there was ordination, and so the word for monk and nun is bhikkhu, which is monk, and bhikkhuni, which is nun. And Vishvapani says, being ordained was a freely chosen personal commitment, and the community was an association of self-reliant individuals who initially needed relatively few rules to govern them. So it was freely chosen, and it was an association of self-reliant individuals. That's quite something, isn't it? So these people were just, decided to, they were acting on their own initiative. And, two of the main disciples, the leading disciples of the Buddha, were two monks called Shariputra and Moggallana, or Moggallana, it's easy to say. And these were two wanderers called Upatissa and Kolita, and they'd been friends since childhood. And then they became wanderers seeking for the truth. And this wasn't unusual in the Buddha's day. It was a time of great social change, and there were a lot of wanderers who were, looking for the truth, ascetics who were practicing all sorts of hardships because they believed that they could free the spirit by punishing the body. And the Buddha had, before he was enlightened, he'd been one of these people. But Upatissa, and they made a pact, Upatissa and Kulita, they'd made a pact that if one of them met an enlightened being, then they'd go and tell the other. So Upatissa met Ashvajit, and Ashvajit just said something that the Buddha had told him. Although I believe that Ashvajit was had already attained to something. And he said, "Those things that arise from a cause, of these the truth finder has told the cause. And that which is their stopping, the great recluse has such a doctrine." And so the world as process of cause and effect. So this was the great truth of conditionality, praticca samutpada. And as the text says, the Dharma eye opened in Upatissa. He had a vision. He saw the way things truly are. And he went to tell his friend, and they both went to the Buddha, and the Buddha ordained them as Shariputra and Moggallana. And these were the most foremost monks. Shariputra was known for his great intellect, and Moggallana was known for his great psychic powers. They also, because of their connections with all the wanderers, they brought the wanderers with them as well. There was lots of different groups, as well as individual homeless wanderers. Lots of different groups who were practicing, and they followed them in and made their own commitment. And they were living in the wilderness. So I think it's very important. I think one of the advantages of going on retreat is that you end up in nature. You live in nature just for a short period of time. And I do think nature, even if it's not the jungles of ancient India, but nature is really important for us. It's something that really helps us reconnect with ourselves, allows us to come home to ourselves. I don't know about you, but just going for a walk in the countryside, I can just begin to calm down a bit, begin to really reconnect with something inside me. It's like sometimes city life sort of jars me to some extent, and nature, the countryside, really begins to speak to me in another way. I had that experience myself when I was on my ordination course for 4 months in the mountains of Spain, and it was just a wonderful experience. And part of that wonderful experience was just living in the wilds, hearing the birds, hearing nightingales sing, watching swallows swoop, seeing the snakes in the mountains, watching ants. It's just incredible when you get more mindful just to notice all the insect life and the ants. Watching red squirrels play, and then just the weather, or the changing mountain weather. Just the beautiful aspect of living in nature for a while. And also I think we can connect with that through, if we're still in the city, but we can connect through it with poetry, some types of poetry, particularly the Romantics. And I just thought I'd read a bit of a poem. This is Wordsworth. And particularly when I was reading Wordsworth a while ago, I was really noticing how he's so in touch. He lived in the Lake District, and he goes for these long walks through the lakes. There was a roaring in the wind all night. The rain came heavily and fell in floods. But now the sun is rising calm and bright. The birds are singing in the distant woods. Over his own sweet voice the stock dove broods. The jay makes answer as the magpie chatters, and all the air is filled with pleasant noise of waters. All things that love the sun are out of doors. The sky rejoices in the morning's birth. The grass is bright with raindrops. On the moors the hare is running races in her mirth, and with her feet she from the plashy earth raises a mist that, glittering in the sun, runs with her all the way, wherever she doth run. So just a bit of Wordsworth, evoking the countryside, evoking nature. So there was the monks, the bhikkhus, but also the bhikkhunis, the nuns. And initially, the Buddha just ordained men. And he was asked by his stepmother, that his stepmother wanted to become a nun, wanted to follow as well. And initially, he refused this. And I remember reading this when I first read about the Buddha, and I found it quite perplexing. And I was quite curious about this, didn't really understand it. And his stepmother Prajapati, when she was refused, 500 of her followers all cut off their hair and donned monastic robes, donned rag robes, and began to just follow the Buddha to where he was. They were absolutely determined to go forth, go into the homeless life. And eventually Ananda, who was the Buddha's cousin and good friend, stepped in and persuaded the Buddha to take. He took up their case, and and then the Buddha did ordain them. Now, it's quite interesting if you read Vishvapani in the Gautama Buddha, what some of the reasons why the Buddha might have done that. Why was he reluctant to do that in the first case? And I think you've got to remember this was such a different time to modern day. It was such a traditional society. And already he was facing a social backlash from a lot of young men leaving their families, because he had such a presence. He had such a lot of men were leaving their families and just following him, going into the homeless life, and it was like a social revolution. He had himself his young son, the Buddha's young son, had taken refuge and gone as a homeless wanderer as well. He's got into a bit of trouble with his family about that. And so the Buddha said, okay, from now on, we're going to have the parents' permission before that happens. But you can imagine this very traditional society being socially disrupted. And it was, for the traditional society to see women going forth was, it was something that was just going to be even more disruptive in a way. And so I think, or at least Vishvapani thinks, and some modern day scholars think it was maybe a way of keeping society on board, making sure that there wasn't this big backlash against him, because they did rely on him. They relied on food. They relied on good relations with them. So again, maybe it was just a matter of time. And there were a number of bhikkhunis, a number of nuns, hundreds of them, and there is the Therigatha, there is a Therigatha, which is the book of the elders, the elder monks. So it's the monks at the time, but the Therigatha is the book of the elder women at the time, and these are verses from enlightened followers of the Buddha, enlightened monks and nuns. These two monks and nuns, these two books. And we find out that many women attained enlightenment just as many men did as well. And the Buddha ordained women on the basis that they could attain enlightenment as well. So Prajapati, Gautama's stepmother, when she was preparing to go forth, she was concerned that she was hearing a lot of teachings and she wasn't quite sure which to go with, as it were. And basically the Buddha was saying, consider the effect a teaching has on you. If you can confidently say it has led to dispassion, not to passion, if it's being unfettered, not to being fettered, then you can conclude this is the Dharma, this is the teacher's instruction. So very important to notice the effect that a teaching has on you. And but you've got to really wholeheartedly try that teaching. It's not just give it a go, but you've actually got to say, well, you can think of it in your own practice. Does the mindfulness of breathing or the metta bhavana work? Have you wholeheartedly tried it? I know some people who just do the mindfulness of breathing because they don't like the metta bhavana, and vice versa. And they're so important to do both practices. So you might want to notice that in your own experience. You know, is there practices that you don't want to engage with? Maybe it's puja. Maybe you've got some resistance to puja. But so the Buddha's instruction is try it out, give it a go, see if it works for you, and then once you've given it a really good try, then you can make that decision on whether it works or not. And so we come to another story in the Buddha's life, and it's the Kosambhya Sutta. And this is a group of bhikkhus, a group of monks, and they'd taken to quarrelling, and the two factions had formed. And this was down to, as Vishvapani says in the book, there was two senior masters, senior teachers in this tradition. There was a teacher of the ethical code, the Vinaya, but there was also the teacher of the Dharma. And accordingly, the teacher of the Dharma, I believe, had left the latrine water pot in the wrong place. And by this time, presumably, the ethical code had got quite sophisticated. And there was all sorts of codes that had come in, all sorts of rules for the monks and the nuns. And one of the Vinaya, one of the other teachers' disciples, noticed this and brought it up. And the teacher who'd done this just thought it was a minor thing. He said, well, it's not a major thing. However, the Vinaya teacher saw it differently. And eventually the two teachers sort of had their own factions, and they ended up quarrelling. And you might think this is a poor way to go about, being a sort of trying to follow the Buddhist path. But it's it happened even in the time of the Buddha. So the Buddha, hearing about this, he arrived and began to talk to them, and trying to understand what had been going on, trying to understand how this had come about. And he provided a teaching for them, and he said, well, if you want to create love and respect, you need to do several things. And three of these things are: maintain bodily acts of loving kindness in public and private to your companions, but also maintain verbal acts of loving kindness and maintain mental acts of loving kindness. So bodily acts are doing things for people, generosity, helping people. If they're sick, helping them, if they're elderly. Verbal acts of loving kindness, speaking kindly, even when they're not around, speaking kindly about your friend, about your companions. And mental acts of loving kindness, doing your best to train your mind to have love and compassion, doing the metta bhavana, but also maintaining mental acts of loving kindness. So important. So important, I think, for the people then, but also for us in our everyday lives, us in our sangha, to act, with bodily verbal and mental acts of loving kindness. It's so important in the world today. That's really what the world needs. You can imagine if a lot of us could do that in the world, how different a place that would be. So why, okay, love, but why respect? Why do you think love and respect? Any ideas? Why is it good to respect people?
I suppose you could love someone in an overbearing way, as if a parent loves a child, and you could not trust them to make their own decisions, whereas respect kind of implies a boundary between you and that person.
Yeah. I think you can have different types of love. In a way, respect, I think, is part of metta, is part of love. And it's in a way you can respect other people's views. You can actually really disagree with people, but you don't have to enter into ill will. You don't have to backbite. You don't have to gossip about them. You can just respect other people's views. If we're in the Sangha, we can respect other people's views because they're also going for refuge as well. And try and understand the other person's point of view. Try and understand what it's like to be them, and try and understand that. I think love and understanding is two sides of the same coin. In a way, we really need to try and understand people to be able to really love them. If we don't understand them, then our love can only go so far. But if we can understand them, then we can really begin to love them, see them as they truly are. And we can have harmony. And it's interesting, we're going to have deeper harmony even though we might disagree. I think it's so important for the Sangha. However, unfortunately, they were stubborn and they didn't really want to hear what the Buddha had to say. And so the Buddha realised that it wasn't any good. So he just wandered off into the forest and decided to meditate on his own for a while. So again, sort of drawing on this point, I was thinking about something that an exercise we do downstairs in breathing space on our mindfulness courses, MBCT, MBSR. So I'm just going to read a phrase out, and I just want you to notice your response. Notice your response, maybe your thoughts, your feelings, your body sensations. So that just a short paragraph. So you're walking down the street, and on the other side of the street you see somebody you know. You smile and wave. The person just doesn't seem to notice and walks by. So any thoughts? You're walking down the street, and on the other side of the street you see somebody you know. You smile and wave. The person just doesn't seem to notice and walks by. So what's your response to that? What's your initial response? Confused, yeah. Any other responses?
Mine would be that they just didn't see me.
They just didn't see you. Maybe they've not got their glasses on. Yeah. Any other? There's no right answer here, by the way. So, any other responses? Any other thoughts?
You might be embarrassed. Lots of people see you wave and saw the other person respond.
Yeah, it's really embarrassing, isn't it? It's like, oh dear, that's I've definitely done that. Yeah. Any other?
Obviously, if you were sure that they saw you,
Mm.
it would be quite hurtful,
A
wouldn't
bit painful, yeah. So you might have all sorts of thoughts about that. I think we're being very polite, actually. Yeah, that's it. Yeah. So when we run the courses downstairs, sometimes people say, "Oh, so-and-so, they're ignoring me," or something like that. Or you get into, like, "Oh, what's wrong with me? Have I done something to upset them?" So you can have all sorts of responses. And really all that's happened is somebody's just walked by, as Linda was saying, maybe they just haven't seen you. And I think it's so important just to realise that, that we can, we basically interpret events as they happen. And we add our whole story, our own backstory. If we're feeling unconfident at that moment, it's a problem with us. If we're feeling irritable, it's a problem with them. Our moods affect how we interpret things. So there's a whole process that goes on there. But it's so important just to really look at the facts, look at the evidence, see what's actually happening. And the phrase which I really, really like on the course that we do is thoughts aren't facts. Thoughts aren't facts. So we think they are, we interpret things as the way they are, but they're not necessarily. There might be an approximation to, we might be getting near there, but they're not actually. We just realise they are thoughts. The Buddha left the quarrelling monks, and he went on his way. And in a way, maybe it wasn't the Buddha who sorted the problem out in that time, because it turns out it was the lay followers of the Buddha, because they got fed up. They got fed up with the quarrelling monks, and they decided to withdraw their support, and that support meant food. And very, very quickly, the two factions made up. They decided to, sort of resolve their differences. The Buddha was invited back, and he talked them through it and gave them more teachings. But when the Buddha went away, he visited 3 of his disciples. And it was in the Eastern Bamboo Park where 3 monks were living. These 3 monks were Aniruddha, Nandya and Kimbala. And Aniruddha was one of his cousins. And initially when he went to the park keeper was quite resistant at asking him not to disturb him. He didn't actually realise it was the Buddha. And then Aniruddha came and said, "Friend, this is the Buddha, our teacher, please allow him in." And the Buddha just sat down with his 3 followers and just asked how they were getting on, if they had any concerns, how they were living their lives. And in many ways, this was these 3 monks were, showing a really, really good way to live, a lovely way to live, a beautiful way to live in harmony. And I'm just going to finish with just things they said. So when the Buddha asked Aniruddha how they lived their life, they said, well, they were homeless wanderers, but they had a hut to come back to, and they all lived together. He said, whoever returns first from the alms round in the village, and the alms round was collecting food, prepares the seats, pours out water for drinking and washing, and places the spittoons. Whoever comes last puts away the seats and the water vessels, washes the spittoons, and sweeps the refectory. If any of us sees that the toilets or the containers of water for drinking or washing are empty, he fills them up. And on every 5th day, we discuss the Dharma late into the night. So very everyday concerns for a monk, and just explaining it, how they're helping each other. And then he goes on to say, we are united like milk and water, friendly and have no quarrels. I am fortunate to live with such fellows, so I act, think and speak to them with loving kindness. Sometimes I reflect, what if I put aside my own wishes and follow the wishes of my companions? Consequently, although we have several bodies, we are one in mind.